I think we'll move on to the last talk, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. And I'm going to talk about stakeholder engagement in the Lifebrain project. So my name is Isabelle Budin-Ljøsne. I'm an ethicist and senior advisor at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. And I've been responsible for stakeholder engagement in Lifebrain for more than 5 years. So how do you engage stakeholders in brain research? That's quite a big question. And I'm going to start with another question. Why on earth should we do that? And there are several good reasons for spending time and energy doing that. First, it's been argued that engaging stakeholders is a way to improve the quality and pertinence of the research that is being conducted, because the stakeholders can come with their views and their experience and their recommendations on how to do the research. Stakeholder engagement might also be a way to improve research uptake. So make sure with help from the stakeholders that the research can be more visible and that its results can be spread out more quickly and used by other stakeholders. Many have also argued that engaging stakeholders is a moral requirement. We are doing research not for ourselves, but for society. And this is a basis that Europe, the European Commission also has laid down with its responsible research and innovation framework, requiring more increasingly that researchers involve stakeholders in all phases of research projects, from designing the project to conducting it and delivering results. So this is what we looked like for 5 years ago when the project started, and we decided that we would do some stakeholder engagement, and we did not really know how to do it. And there are different ways or different levels of stakeholder engagement. You could, let's say, inform stakeholders about what's happening in our project. So providing information that would be more similar to dissemination, when you regularly put information on your website, for instance, about what's happening in the project. That's kind of the first level, so to speak. Or you could consult stakeholders. And that would mean asking them about their advice on specific questions. And that could be done regularly or more ad hoc, depending on your needs. And you could do that with all kinds of stakeholders. That would be cohort participants, patients, patient organizations, clinicians, researchers, the general public, whatever. It's up to you to decide. Then the next level would be to go a bit more further and involve them in some of our activities as researchers, so that they could, for instance, help us design some of our research activities and come up with their ideas and experiences. And the last or upper level would be to really set up some collaborations with the stakeholders, where we are equal partners working together with research activities. So in Lifebrain, what we did is that we were very lucky to set up a stakeholder engagement work package that I led. We committed a budget to this work package, and we offered the opportunity to all researchers in the project to participate on a voluntary basis to this work package if they wanted to and if they were interested. And it turned out that many were interested, which was definitely an advantage for the project. We did set up early on in the project a stakeholder catalogue, which was kind of an overview of all the stakeholders that we thought could be interesting to engage in the project at some point. So this was kind of a reference list. And since we are an international project, we set up a list of stakeholders from many different countries and all the countries that we are represented in. And we worked at the very beginning on a stakeholder engagement plan, where we did set up a number of activities that we were planning to do throughout the duration of the project, involving different types of stakeholders. And for Lifebrain, the most, let's say, the stakeholders we focused on were cohort participants, patient organizations and patient registries, research communities, research groups, clinicians, and the media and the general public. So quite a number of stakeholders, actually quite broad. And we tried to discuss, or we had many discussions at the beginning of the project to find out how are we going to interact with these stakeholders, what should be the key principles for doing that. And we kind of agreed that the stakeholders should be able to engage freely in activities depending on their resources, their ability, their interest, and their competence. And the reason why I'm saying that is that if you look at some stakeholder engagement recommendations or guidelines from other projects or groups, they would be quite strict at saying that you need to set up a very detailed list of activities together with the stakeholders, and everything has to be set right from the beginning. While we had more like a pragmatic approach, let's see how things develop in a way, kind of approach. So we decided that the stakeholders would be free to join our activities as co-decision makers or co-organizers in the planning and organization of activities. And we basically decided to run 3 different types of activities: research, workshops, or public events, and public lectures. And dissemination comes on top of that. So the stakeholder engagement work package did its own research. And that means that we first looked at our core participants in the project, and we investigated their views regarding brain health, which is a concept that Lifebrain relies very much upon and had as an objective to make more visible, also outside the research project. So we did conduct some research. We had interviews with research participants at 4 different locations. We investigated their views regarding brain health. We collected some data. All the researchers, or at least many researchers in the Lifebrain consortium, were involved in that work. It was really a team effort, and this enabled us to develop some publications. After we had done this, we kind of felt that, oh, this is fun. Let's do a little bit more. So we launched what we call the Global Brain Health Survey. And this was really a large team effort across all partners in Lifebrain. So we did set up an online survey also to investigate public perceptions on brain health. The survey was made available in 14 different languages, and that's also the advantage of having a project like Lifebrain, where you have people from many different countries involved. The survey was launched in 2019, and what we did is that we collaborated with several national brain councils, brain foundations, brain registries that found the survey interesting and were willing to help us disseminate it, because this was an open survey that anybody above the age of 18 could answer. And again, we had this pragmatic approach, which I think is my key take-home message, because we started collaborating with the Norwegian Brain Council, because this was the first contact we had, and the Norwegian Brain Council helped us contact the German Brain Council, that helped us contact the Belgian Brain Council, and then the one thing led to another. And I think that's really the way we did it in Lifebrain, that we had some objectives, but we also wanted to have this flexibility and enable stakeholders to engage whenever they were interested. So we launched the survey in Oslo in 2019, together with the Norwegian Brain Council. We got a lot of help from stakeholders, organizational stakeholders, to spread the survey, but also the researchers in Lifebrain spent a lot of time doing that. And we ended up collecting responses for more than 27,000 people across 81 countries, which was quite good, I would say, at least more than what we were expecting. And all these data provided us with a lot of information that we could then deliver to the general public and to all stakeholders through public reports and scientific publications. So it really enabled us to produce something as a work package and providing something that the stakeholders also found beneficial to use in their own work. We also had a number of stakeholder workshops that we also tried to organize as much as possible with stakeholders. So again, always this idea that we are coming with a suggestion, let's do something together. Are you interested? What would you like to be the focus in this workshop? And we so organized several workshops together with stakeholders. After some time, we focused a little bit more on organizing these workshops together with the stakeholders that were collaborating with us on the Global Brain Health Survey, and always having this approach that we suggest something and let's see whether that works or not. We also had a number of public lectures and events, but we also tried as much as possible to organize with the stakeholders. The latest one we had was last night at a pub here in Oxford. And it was a very interesting and interactive experience because that enables us as researchers to have contact with the general public, something that we are not always used to do. And it also brings a number of perspectives and things that we might not necessarily have thought about. And it also obliges us to think a little bit differently in terms of how we present our research and the work we've been conducting and the kinds of issues we want to discuss with people. We were also present at some science festivals. So this is from 2019, before the pandemic, with huge success. And once we had to go online due to lockdown, we then again were able to organize some events online. Also always with help from brain foundations, national brain councils. So all along we've been working together with stakeholders to organize these events. And of course, public events like conferences like the one we have today and the one we had in Berlin several years ago. So what about our experiences after 5 years of conducting stakeholder engagement in the project? It was for us very beneficial to have a dedicated work package and dedicated staff. I think it really made it very clear for the project that this is something we want to do, and we also had the resources to do it. We experienced that establishing trustful relationships is very resource demanding, not only with research participants, but also with stakeholders. It takes time and it requires local presence. So within Lifebrain, we had the possibility to do that because we are present in different countries. But we realized after some point that it's not possible to maintain good contact with all stakeholders. You have to be selective and gives priority to those with whom we have good relationships, and we see that there is opportunity for doing something useful together. Again, my point about having a predefined program for what we wanted to do in the project was useful, but flexibility is really important. I don't think it would have worked to go to the stakeholders and say, okay, we want to do this and this and this and this together with you, and it's going to take so much time, and we need you to commit to that, because they are in the exact same situation as we are, that their agendas are full and they have limited resources and they need to prioritize. My experience was that conducting research activities, so the interviews we've done with cohort participants, the Global Brain Health Survey, was really a strong motivator for the researchers in Lifebrain, but also for the stakeholders, because they saw that this is something, the researchers saw that this is something they could use in their professional career, because we did publications, we collected data. And for the stakeholders, this was also something that they could use in their own work, the results of our research. material that they're going to use in their lobbying work or information work. So, there needs to be something in it for all, not just for us as a consortium. It's also created some challenges that we were maybe not prepared for. Because, for instance, when we conducted the Global Brain Health Survey and started collecting data, and then we tried again to be open and said to the stakeholders, you can contribute as you like and you can collaborate with us on the data, then it created some kind of insecurity about how the data would be used, who would have access to it, what were the conditions for doing that. We never wrote any written agreements with the stakeholders. It was all based on trust, and that worked to some extent, because also I think we were lucky. We did not encounter any disagreements or issues. But if it had been the case, maybe it would have been a bit more challenging. So for future projects, it might be worth thinking about this as well. COVID, of course, had implications for engagement, because all of a sudden, both the stakeholders and the researchers in Lifebrain had very pressing issues to deal with. We managed to go online, but it kind of killed a bit the it killed a bit the ambience, because we couldn't have the same interaction with the stakeholders as we had before. But anyhow, we managed to have quite some impact through these activities. We reached more than 28,000 individuals, and I'm not counting the disseminations activities we had in addition, like newsletters, using social media, press releases, media articles, etc., etc. We conducted small surveys among our stakeholders to get a sense of how their experiences were in terms of collaborating with us. And the feedback was very positive, especially the Global Brain Health Survey co-organizers were very happy about the outcome of the work. They raised some challenges regarding future potential collaboration. Time is, of course, an issue for them. They need to have some budget to do some work with us. And they also said that if you are coming with a new project to us and want to collaborate, this has to be relevant for our work. So again, what's in it for me is a question we get from the stakeholders. They were happy, or they thought it was good to have a contact person to collaborate with. They appreciated the flexibility, and they wanted to see again that there was some benefit for them in participating or working with us. So I think that was it. There's a lot of other things I think we could say about this. This is just an illustration. We had a public lecture in a very small place in Norway, small place between the mountains in Lom for a few weeks ago, but just to illustrate that it's also possible to organize public events like this in smaller places, not just the big cities. The room was full, stuffed with people who were very interested. So it's absolutely possible. We are summarizing our experiences in a paper that we submitted to PLOS ONE. And if you want to know more, let's take some time to discuss that. Thank you. So, Michael, I think we have some time for questions. Maybe we want to have a little dialogue as well. I would be very curious to hear your thoughts about the work we have done regarding stakeholder engagement in the project. Yeah. Well, first of all, are there any questions to either Michael or... Yes, please.
Michael, so you made the point that informed consent is not sufficient ethically. But if you put aside the question about the broadness of that consent and potential reuse of data, which we might address with reconsent or stakeholder groups, can you give us an example of why that's not sufficient?
there's two ways of thinking about it. I think one is, so you might take the view, so I think there's two ways of thinking about it. One way is that there are many where fairly open is fully competitive. I'm on my way to a meal. There are some other people at the restaurants and friends ahead of me, and they're about to go to the kitchen and say, what would you like to eat? And I say, just pick something for me. And that's and there are a whole range of other ways in which we give consent in ways that are not fully informed. Getting married would be getting married would be another one possible. So that's one response to say that a one-off consent under certain circumstances, just because you don't know if it's going to happen. I am that view largely. In the context of medical research, I think it will be reasonable for someone to say, well, but you want people to know enough that you feel confident that they've made a choice that, either some sort of, they're making it to some extent informed choice, even if it's not perfect. And secondly, you want them, if you're going to allow certain open-endedness, you don't want to allow them to sign up to something which is going to be harmful to them in a way which is firstly seriously harmful to them in a way, but secondly it's going to undermine trust in scientific research. People end up in, I was just in the discussion earlier about challenge studies, for example, diseases, in order to study the disease. That's a very common practice in infectious disease research. There's always a question about how much research is acceptable. And I think you can't solve that problem in this kind of context by consent alone. What you need to do is have some rules around which say that we're going to make sure that our scientific practice provides some kind of effect. So the second example is the second way of responding is to say, oh, what going on? I was looking, maybe I was using that one as well. Sorry.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, that's better. Sorry. So one way of thinking about it is to say one-off consent is perfectly acceptable. Another way is to say that fully informed consent isn't really possible in the context of this kind of work. So, it doesn't seem responsible to just leave things there, to get people to sign a piece of paper and that's it. It feels like even if you just think about the future of trust in science, we need to put other things in place. But obviously, we hopefully are not just thinking about that, we're thinking about it. So it's not an example, it's just a sort of another way of saying it.
Can I ask you something about this?
Yeah.
Because, well, as you said, informed consent is not always sufficient, or it's difficult to get to develop an informed consent that is good enough. And you mentioned trustworthiness, that trustworthiness is maybe the way to go to compensate for a lack of good consent. But I think most researchers experience that going to an ethics committee and telling them, oh, my informed consent is maybe not the best one ever, but we have a lot of trust, that obviously will not be sufficient. So what do you see as the right strategy to make ethics committees understand that we are doing large-scale data sharing, something that they're still often not very much familiar with, and we know that we are acting in a way that creates trustworthiness, and how can you, in a way, document that?
Well, I think there's a few things to say about that. One thing is that sometimes it goes the other way as well. So sometimes the ethics committee is overly restrictive, but there are some areas, in my experience, I've done a lot of work in malaria genomics, where ethics committees will just sign something off. So a good example would be a big study which was in West Africa, and the ethics committee was very concerned about the export of blood samples because there's a whole range of cultural and other reasons associated concerns. And the scientists said, well, actually, no, we're not taking blood samples, we're going to use saliva. And the ethics committee said, okay, that's all fine, then we'll sign it off. And they hadn't sort of, clearly DNA and other kinds of information are still going to be shared. But it was because there was a local view about blood. So that in that case, the ethics committee wasn't overly restrictive. They were actually overly liberal because they didn't understand the science. So obviously, I think one thing you can do is to do what do the kind of work you've been doing really, which is to build in that kind of work in a way which then enables you to make the case to the ethics committee that you've done the work, as it were, and you can provide a reasoned account. The other, I suppose, is to get participants involved in some more active way. So, for example, my Genomics England experience, the ethics committee was very resistant at one point to allowing certain kinds of data to be used. And the participants wrote to the ethics committee and said, we're not, there's a participant panel, they wrote and said, we're not happy with this. And the ethics committee then invited some of them along and changed their mind. I mean, there's not much you can do because ethics committees, as you say, are not really completely up to date necessarily with science, but I think those are the only routes that are available to you, really. I don't know, you're the expert in this field.
But I'm not an ethics committee. That's what I've been trying to explain for many years.
I think there's definitely a job to be done around training ethics committees, but that's always going to be a sort of horizon that moves away from you, isn't it? I think. But what do you think?
Well, it's $1,000 question, because doing the work that we've been doing in Lifebrain regarding stakeholder engagement is a way to create trust, but that's the work that you do after you've got the ethics approvals, not before.
On the screen.
Yep. Is it move first?
A few questions here as well.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Now I can hear you, but no, I can't hear you. Give me a second. Can I hear you now?
Do you hear us now?
I'm going to ask my question, and when I shut up, I think I'm going to be able to hear you because I think you can hear me. Now I'm having some technical issues, so I'm sorry about that. I'm wondering a bit in the follow-up to this, like, so whenever we apply for ethics, I always get a bit annoyed with our ethics committee because they want us to explain in detail in the informed consent everything we're doing. So and our consent ends up being like this 20-30 page thing that of course none of them read through, or maybe like 2% of them actually read through and then they sign. So they do trust us, which is awesome. But then what is the informed consent for then? Like, is it literally just bureaucracy? It's just like signing off all these terms of use that we have, like for Apple or Google or whatever. We're just like, I have no idea what it says, but I need to do this thing, so I'm just going to go, yeah, whatever. So what does this actually mean to get an informed consent? Because if you over-inform them, they're not going to read it and they'll just go, yeah, whatever.
So obviously, I have been on ethics committees, but I'm not now. I think I'm interested in the kind of question you asked, which is, you're not saying explicitly, but are there ethical problems that arise about these kind of tools that are used? Are there problems that they create which are not just practical? They're also ethical. And I think there are, and I think they miss the point. So the origin of a consent form. I mean, there were consent forms of types before this, but the primary origin is in the Nuremberg Code and this idea that informed consent is going to solve your problems. But ultimately, it's behind it is the idea of respect for people's autonomy, but if you're serious about autonomy, that surely ought to mean that real people in the real world ought to be able to make decisions about their life in their own way, irrespective of the fact that the world is often complicated, open-ended, uncertain, things change, etc. And my personal view is that if you focus too much on the consent form in that kind of way, you're missing the point of what respect for autonomy means. It's about real people making decisions. That is, again, no excuse for doing it badly, but we do at least have to have at the center of at the front of our minds what this is all about. And information isn't going to solve the problem. Or clearly, if you tell them nothing, then that is, if you're not transparent, or if you're deceptive, if you provide information that's not true, clearly that's wrong. But providing more and more information is to support your point is not going to help that decision-making process to be an ethical one. So I think ethics committees themselves are sometimes misunderstood what the point is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of experience with ethics committees, and many of them are not good at all. And I think it repeatedly comes back to the point just raised, that the consent form is all the time a complaint from the committee. And I think they misunderstand it, like you said. So that point taken. But I think that sort of the approach from many ethics committees are wrong. I think they sort of see the main point being to stop most things instead of saying, like you started out with, we are actually doing something good. And many years ago, I started doing science on pregnant women. I was interested in omega-3 fatty acids, and I would like to study fetal development, depending on dietary intake of omega-3 fatty acids. And I was delayed for 3 years because somebody said that this is not ethical. And it happens repeatedly. And I think it's unethical not to study it. And the same thing came up with COVID-19. It is certainly unethical, according to my understanding, not studying pregnant women. They are exposed to the same problem. And to me, the whole approach is from the wrong side.
We've got a bit of tendency in ethics. So I'm in general, but particularly in research ethics, we've got a bit of a tendency, sometimes doing things is unethical and sometimes not doing things is unethical. And we've got a tendency to focus on situations where we're doing something and think, is that ethical? We very rarely pay attention to whether the question of whether not doing something is unethical. And you've just given one example. I'll give another example from the malaria research. There was a point where there were 8,000 samples from children who'd had malaria in a biorepository, but the consent for those was for research on malaria. It was done a fairly long time ago, and the question was it acceptable to do genetic research on those samples? Wasn't whole genome sequencing, but it was kind of some SNPs and stuff, and the ethics committee wouldn't allow that. And it seems to me, there are clearly ethical questions related to doing research where the consent is ambiguous to some extent. But the idea that you solve that problem by going and sticking needles in 8,000 more children doesn't seem to me to be an ethically unproblematic route either. And it's another example of your situation. And pregnant women, research with pregnant women is a good example. Probably if you ask your participants, they would probably be saying, we want research on our.
That's basically the feedback we get from participants, not only Lifebrain, but in all kinds of research that participants want to help.
Yeah.
They want the research to be conducted. Christina?
Yeah, so thank you very much for great talks. So I have a question for Michael. And so regarding consent, so I've been researching children for more than 20 years, and I've noticed the shift that you're talking about, that we need to justify exclusion rather than inclusion. But regarding consent, I think this is very problematic when it comes to data sharing, especially when it comes to genetics, but also beyond genetics. You can go in detail so that essentially this person can be identified. And we usually regard in Scandinavia children as having autonomy from a very early age. But yeah, if we have parental consent to share child data, the widest kind of sharing, I cannot see how it can be ethically done, actually. Can you consent on behalf of your child to that kind of data sharing? Personally, I feel that is very, very hard. Do you have any views on this?
Well, I can see the problem. The way that works, the trouble is often these things get solved at a kind of project by project level, I think, as well.
I'm talking about the widest data.
Yeah.
ABCD, not project by project. You can apply for those data and you can use them for whatever. It's pretty straightforward to get the ABCD data, including the genetics, the brain imaging, the health data, everything.
Right.
And these were 9 to 11 when they were included. And in Norway, we have younger children included. And so, of course, you are welcome to reconsent when they get older in our studies. But I was just thinking about those who are not asked again.
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with, I can imagine some situations in which it might be justified, but in general, I think And this is going to vary country by country in terms of what counts as being
But
an adult. Well, but I think my answer, I mean, will vary, which is I certainly think that young people at some point should have the opportunity to say no.
But then they can say no because the data have already been shared.
So that then raises the question about this kind of trusted research environment approach. So I'm skeptical about that, but I'm more skeptical. What's tended to happen? The UK Biobank, for example, has tended to ship its data. So you apply for the thing and I don't know how you get it. You get it on a hard drive or something. Whereas these newer approaches are, sometimes people refer it, instead of data sharing, they refer it to it as data visiting. So you can come into an environment.
You're not talking about that.
No.
You download the data, you treat them yourself.
Yeah. No,
And I'm just thinking about this because it's really, really important that we have these developmental data. But I'm also very skeptical of the broadest kind of sharing for those who cannot consent because they don't know, and the stakeholder engagement work wouldn't work for those. They're 4-year-olds. I mean, you can engage them in whatever, they will be happy, but they might changing identities you talked about. They might not be happy about it when they reach age of health authority and they're 16.
How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that then? So what's your answer? I mean, this is it's certainly true, for example, also in the context of the work I've done. I've been involved around genetics of developmental disorders, for example. There are these big data sets, these ways in which that data is shared. What do you think the solution is?
So I think there are limits to what can be shared before they are 16. I think, for instance, I am skeptical of sharing their genetic data until they have reconsented when they're like that age. Actually, I before, depending on the information, but at least in Norway, 16 is the formal age where they have health authority. And I would be skeptical of sharing children's data widely, openly like that, so that it can't be undone.
So you think it should be done more like within a collaboration or something, rather?
Yes, I think so, so that they can't just be downloaded somewhere by someone who can keep them forever. That's my view. Since you asked, I haven't actually spelled this out before, but that's my view. Yeah.
So I think, so it's the same age in the UK. I mean, it's 16, but beyond that, below that, people can give consent sometimes. I think from an ethics perspective. So I understand your perspective, and I share it to some extent. I suppose to me, it would depend how big the potential benefit to children would be. But from, let's say, you could think of some examples where there might be, I'm trying to think of some examples, but, situations in which there are very serious diseases in childhood, which would require that kind of sharing. I don't know what it might be, Duchenne muscular dystrophy or something, or, these kind of things. So I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just saying a lot would depend for me on whether you could still get the same benefit if you waited till they were 16. If as a scientist you say no, it doesn't matter, then I'd agree with you. But if someone could convince me that it was only by sharing the data when they were young that scientific knowledge could be produced, then I might start to be convinced it should be shared. But
you never know that.
Yeah, well, that's.
Okay, I think it was Anders first, and then Klaus.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is a very interesting question, and but I was wondering whether you have any concrete examples of how to get around this issue that consents are possible to understand to participants in our studies. They are quite complex, and they are so complex that I couldn't even write the consent from about genetics. I had to ask our geneticist because I made it wrong. I asked for a wrong consent, so as you said, it's very hard. What we really want to do is to make the participants understand what they are consenting to, and it's ending up in a situation where you need a medical degree and in statistics and law to understand what they are consenting to. But do you have any concrete examples or how to avoid this problem? Because it's an ever-increasing problem as our research is more and more complex.
Genomics UK did it quite well.
You've got, I'm sure you can answer this better. I think, so this is, there are probably Americans in the room, so but I think there's a particular kind of American approach, which is very contractualist around research participation and big pharmaceutical companies in particular. But so there's this view that if you've got everything written down and it's signed, you somehow don't have any obligations anymore because people have signed it away, which I think is a bit questionable in its own right, but also the problem never gets solved. I think the only way you can think about this really, firstly, is to acknowledge that that's clearly not the way to treat people with moral respect. But secondly, I think there are some good examples. So, and there are two I've been involved in that I'm not going to say are necessarily good, but I know that there are organisations. So, Genomics England has produced a lot of sort of video-based approaches to consent and relatively short forms. And there's another initiative in the UK called Our Future Health, which is going to recruit 5 million healthy people. These are adults, so not children, but so it doesn't solve your problem, but there are people out there who are trying to develop models in a sort of evidence-based way, but they're never going to work if you buy into the problem that every detail has to be explained. Then no model can deal with that. You have to buy into the idea that it's got to be a compromise between clarity and kind of transparency.
Because we were playing with this idea to make experiments with different consent forms. One that I think is maximally informative, in a sense that it communicates what we want it to communicate. And you can have different levels of details held down to the level that our ethical committee requires. Give this to random people. Let them read it and then let them answer questions about what they actually consented to. I'm pretty sure that knowledge of what they consented to is not the form we are obliged to give them. And I think this would be strong evidence that this is not an ethical good way of doing it.
Yeah, so I think that's right. So one of the things I often say to medical students and also in this is that people think that ethics is a sort of not an empirical discipline, but if you've just given an example of where actually you could make many of these decisions in an evidence-based way. That's right. That's kind of what.
Klaus first, and then Christine.
Yes, I was actually going to respond to Christina in the same way you did. I mean, I don't understand ethics decision as rules, but as negotiations, you always have to weigh up potential benefits and risks. So for each proposal, there are research proposals, which of course you don't know whether they're actually going to be fulfilled at the end of the day. But for each proposal that proposes a certain benefit, you then have to try to compute how much of a risk you would allow the participants to bear. And I think if one probably ought to take one step back, because in my mind, to establish trustworthiness, you have to make sure you've got a transparent, principled and systematic approach to arriving at an ethics permission for a particular project. And that has to be a sort of, has to be an individual negotiation based on the circumstances of the project. The only problem I see is that there is an inbuilt escalation, whether that is driven by society, which wants to codify everything, or legal cases or precedents or whatever. So in the end, everything does not specifically allowed is forbidden, which I think, which results in pages and pages of protocols and consent forms, which I think if anybody did this systematically, they probably would find out that nobody actually understands what they're reading and signing. So in my mind, there needs to be a reset of this, of what's acceptable as a systematic and principled approach, so that you can actually find the balance between the complexity of information and the knowledge, the pre-knowledge of the participant.
Okay, Christine, and then.
As a comment to that, although you said the balance between the complexity and the necessity of, information here and what the resources of the person, there are huge individual differences in this. And it struck me the other day because I was writing informed consent as support for parents to 4-year-olds, right? And then for the 12-year-olds and the adults. And I was thinking some adults would have just preferred to have the 4-year-old consenting. And some would have preferred the 12, and some would have preferred the 4. So maybe everyone could just get all of them and they could choose which one to read. I realize that it sounds really horrible, but they have different needs and different resources to begin with. Because in a way because I actually was very satisfied with the 4-year-old, and you were too. Yeah. It just struck us that this factor.
I also think that's maybe a good idea that you have to short version and a long version and a full juridical version. Very detailed if you want to.
Because then it was like one line is what happens if you don't participate? Nothing happens for the 4-year-old. And then for the next, it was, you know, you have more, it's better actually.
And people want simple information most of the time. Because again, participation in research is primarily based on trust.
But some want more, so then they can have the 20 pages.
Okay, just to move beyond the never-ending informed consent debate, and I see that time is running out. Could we just have a concluding note by asking you about data sharing? So Lifebrain will continue. We will continue sharing data and continue with our collaboration in the future, even though we don't have specific funding as of today's date, but that might come up in the future. What would you say, and now I'm not thinking about informed consent because it has very much turned into some bureaucratic exercise, but what would you say should be the guiding principles for us as a consortium when doing data sharing in the future? You said something about diversity, but I found very interesting. And that's something that we also realized we should consider a bit more in the future. That was our experience with the Global Brain Health Survey, that we definitely lack diversity there. So what would be guiding principles for us so that we have a take-home message that is positive?
I love the way that you got to ask all the questions. No, you have to answer some too. I think I said most of it there. I mean, I think the first thing is that you don't want. I'm assuming, obviously I'm not a scientist in space, but my assumption is you don't want a dead data set. This way, you want new data. You want it to grow, and presumably there's a point at which a data set gets out of date because there will be people who've, as I say, non-scientists, but there will be people who've had in your data set who've had interventions of some kind over the life of this, and in 10 years' time, those interventions may not even be used in clinical practice anymore. So you want a data set that's kind of more up to date in various ways, I'm assuming. So that's one reason why you want to maintain public trust and confidence, because your data sources depend upon that kind of long-term sustained consent, sustained trust. And that's obviously funders, health systems, and so on. And there are a range of questions to do with the collaborations that you have. So you want to make sure that people get treated fairly in a scientific way as well. But yeah, the data set has to be, I think, increasingly, and I'm sure this is true in other countries too, and certainly in the UK, diversity of data sets is a really big issue. And it's closely associated with other concerns to do with why it is that disadvantaged groups of various kinds don't have access to services or don't access services because they're often not relevant. So there's kind of a vicious circle around that. So I think having a data set that is rich in the right kinds of ways is really important. Obviously, there are costs associated with that, and it's not easy. There's a huge amount of resource and time required to do that work. So I'm not naive about that. But so, for example, in the 100,000 Genomes Project, making specific efforts to access communities of different kinds of ethnic minority communities and get them informed enough to make a choice about whether to participate and is a significant cost. So it's not simple. But anyway, I mean that's one thing that I think is worth. How about you?
Well, I really like the diversity point because that's something we realized when we were collecting our data. But I'm still struggling with the trust aspect. How do you do that in practice? I mean, stakeholder engagement is one thing, but as we experienced, it would require unlimited resources if you want to do this with all your groups and all your participants. Yeah. So there's something missing still.
Trust can go wrong indoors.
Yeah.
You can have. That's why I use this phrase "well-founded trust" because you can get people to trust quite easily in some ways, but so you don't want people to trust too quickly. In the same way, you don't want them to not trust at all. So how do you do that? But also, just on the diversity point, I was thinking of ethnic diversity, but obviously there's a whole range of other forms of diversity, and you've done work on social deprivation, for example. As part, there's a whole range of ways in which a data set needs to be diverse.
Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was a difficult exercise. Thank you. Do you have a final note?
Should have been more.
We'll just press the button on the front. So what I did.
Busy, but I thought maybe then that's good. Great. Okay, thanks again for great talks, both of you. We're not gonna do any summing up or any evaluation. You stay calm, but Barbara and I just wanted to say a final thank you to the hosts, the organizers here in Oxford. So maybe you will.
Yes, first I would like to thank to Diana, who has really helped so much around logistics and took good care of us and all of our wishes here. So thank you. And Norway, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been really great. And also, Klaus. Thank you so much for sticking out with us.
Thanks so much. This is
Really
just what I needed.